you have felt it, maybe, on certain nights. You lie down at your usual hour, tired in the ordinary way, and sleep will not quite arrive. The room is dark, nothing is wrong, and still your mind stays a half step awake, turning, listening for something you could not name. In the morning you glance out the window and find it there, pale above the rooftops, almost full, and a small old thought comes to you. Maybe it was that. You talk yourself out of it before the coffee is poured, but the question does not leave. It is one of the oldest suspicions our kind has ever carried. Long before anyone kept records, before there were words for hormones or brainwaves or sleep at all, people looked up at a full moon rising over the tree line and felt certain it did something to them. That it thinned their rest, that it stirred the mind and left the night restless in a way the ordinary dark never did. The belief is old enough that it pressed itself into the language we still speak. The word lunatic comes straight down from luna, the Latin name for the moon, from an age when a bright full moon and a troubled mind were assumed to be the same weather rolling through. Even the greatest minds of the ancient world took it as settled fact rather than folklore. Aristotle, more than 2,000 years ago, wrote that the moon could reach into the human mind, working upon the moist brain the way it worked upon the sea, as though the skull held one more tide pool, answering to the pull overhead. Centuries later, the Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder set it down in his great encyclopedia of the world, describing how the full moon made the brain unnaturally moist and tipped certain people toward madness and seizures. He even reached for the word we still use, moonstruck. The physician Galen carried the idea forward into medicine, tying the moon's fullness to the shifting balance of the body's humors, so that for a very long stretch of human history, a full moon on the calendar was something a careful person prepared for. And the moon was blamed for so much more than lost sleep. It was blamed for madness in the wards, for fevers in the blood, for crime in the streets, for the strange restlessness that seemed to gather on certain nights and set the world slightly on edge. Hospital staff braced for the full moon. So did the people who kept watch through the dark hours, the nurses and the night porters and the ones who worked while everyone else slept. Many of them will still tell you, quietly and with complete conviction, that the full moon changes the shape of a night shift, that things happen, that people are different when the moon is round. For most of the modern era, science listened to all of that, went looking with cold and patient tools, and gently set it aside. When researchers counted up the emergencies and the births and the crimes and the sleepless nights and lined them against the phase of the moon, the effect kept dissolving in their hands. The crime waves were not there. The tides of madness were not there. What had looked for centuries like a pattern turned out to be, more often, the mind's own hunger for one. We remember the full moon nights that went wrong and let the ordinary ones slip away unremembered, and out of that quiet accounting error a legend is born and kept alive. When scientists at last gathered dozens of these studies together and weighed them as one great body of evidence, the verdict came back the same as it had piecemeal. Taken all together, the nights of the full moon were not measurably stranger than any other. The pull we felt so certain of kept slipping straight through the net every time anyone tried to catch it in numbers. It was there in the feeling and gone from the data, which is exactly how a superstition behaves. The proposed machinery never held up either. The old idea was gravity, the notion that the moon tugs the water in the brain the way it tugs the ocean into tides. But the arithmetic is merciless. The moon's gravitational pull on a single human body is almost unimaginably small. One astronomer put it in a way that is hard to forget, saying that a mosquito resting on your arm exerts a stronger gravitational pull on you than the moon does across all that distance. And no one has ever reported a mosquito driving anyone to madness. So the tidy verdict settled into place, and it held for a long time. The moon and your sleep had nothing real between them. It was folklore, a lovely story we told ourselves to give the restlessness a shape and a cause. That is where the matter rested. And it might have stayed there, closed and filed away with the other pretty superstitions, if not for a small and almost accidental study that arrived and did the one thing no one had managed before. It caught the moon in the place it had never been caught, inside a sealed room, with no way for the old belief to sneak in through the eyes or the mind. In the year 2013, a chronobiologist named Christian Kajoshen and his colleagues at the University of Basel in Switzerland published a short paper in the journal current biology. What made it land the way it did was not its size. It was tiny, only around 30 volunteers, spread across two age groups, the young and the older. What set it apart was where the data had come from and how completely clean it was of expectation. The recordings came out of a sleep laboratory, not an ordinary bedroom, but a controlled chamber with no windows, no clock on the wall, no phone, no thread of sunrise slipping under the door. A place built to seal a person off from every cue the outside world uses to whisper the time into a sleeping body. Under that stringent protocol, the volunteers had come in and slept, wired for the night, their brainwaves traced in slow rolling lines across a monitor, their hormones read from small samples of saliva gathered in the evening before the lights went down. The purpose of all that care, at the time, had been to study the plain machinery of human sleep and the inner clock that governs it. The moon was nowhere in the design. No one had it in mind at all, and this is the detail that gives the whole thing its strange, quiet beauty. While those people slept in that sealed chamber, neither the volunteers nor the scientists watching over them had the faintest idea what the moon was doing in the sky outside. Lunar phase was not on anyone's mind. No one could have tilted the results to flatter a belief, because in that room, in those hours, no one was holding the belief. The thought to go back and check the moon came much later, and by the account that has followed the paper ever since, it arrived the way a surprising number of good ideas do. Casually, sideways, in conversation. Someone, over a drink, wondered aloud whether the old moon stories might be hiding inside the sleep numbers they already had, waiting to be found. So they returned to the archive, laid each recorded night of sleep beside the lunar phase that had hung over it, and looked, and there was something there. Let me give you what they found plainly, because the numbers are gentle, and they deserve to be heard as they are, rather than dressed up. Around the full moon, the deep, slow brain activity that marks the most restorative stretch of the night, the great delta waves that roll through the sleeping mind, fell by about 30%. On those same nights, people took roughly 5 minutes longer to drift off. They slept about 20 minutes less in total. When they were asked afterward, they rated that sleep as poorer, without being able to say why. And in the evenings around the full moon, their bodies made less melatonin, the hormone that rises in the dark and eases the way towards sleep. That is a real cluster of findings, every one of them leaning the same direction, all of it surfacing in a room where the moon could not be seen, and its phase was unknown to every living soul inside. Kajashen offered a careful phrase for what it might mean: a circulunar clock. An inner rhythm keyed not to the turning of the day but to the long, slow swing of the moon across the month, much as we already knew that certain creatures of the sea carried the tides folded inside their bodies. The suggestion was that human beings might hold a muted version of the same inheritance, a monthly rhythm buried deep beneath everything that our distant ancestors lived by, and that most of us have long since drowned under the flat and endless glow of electric light. It was a beautiful idea. Restrained, careful, testable, and just strange enough to be true. The old superstition, it began to seem, had been standing next to something real the entire time. To feel the weight of that word, circulunar, hold it beside the one most of us already live by without noticing. Circadian. The daily clock, the one that lifts you toward morning and lowers you toward night, whether or not you glance at a clock, ticking away inside every cell you have. Marine creatures, worms and corals and certain fish are known to carry a second and slower clock beside it, one tuned to the roughly 29.5 days of the moon, timing their spawning to a particular tide as if the whole ocean had agreed on a date. The quiet, astonishing suggestion in Kajoken's paper was that some worn remnant of that lunar clock might still be turning in us too, far below awareness, mostly overwritten by the day but never entirely silenced. More persuasive still was that the pull showed up in both the younger volunteers and the older ones, and that every separate thread pointed the same direction at once. The slow brainwaves of deep sleep, the timing of sleep's arrival, the length of the night, the plain report of poorer rest, the dip in evening melatonin, none of them contradicting the others. When several independent measures all lean together like that, a careful mind leans with them, and it is right too, And yet the honest footnote was there in plain sight the whole while, waiting to matter. It was a small study, only around 30 people. A glimpse, not a proof, drawn out of a room that had been built to ask a completely different question. The story could stop right there, and a great many retellings of it do stop there, on that satisfying note. But to end it there would be to leave out the most important part. And on a night meant for honesty, the most important part is this: that striking finding, the one that made the headlines and rekindled the old belief, largely did not survive. Because a good result is not the finish line of science. It is an invitation to everyone else. When a claim like this appears, the very next thing that is supposed to happen is that other researchers go hunting for the same effect in their own data, to see whether it stands up when different hands hold it. And the year after Kajokan's paper appeared, a group did exactly that, among them Martin Dressler, working at the Max Planck Institute of Psychiatry in Munich. They gathered up sleep recordings they already had in their files. 3 separate samples, each one far larger than the original, hundreds of measured nights in every group, and more than 20,000 nights of sleep all told across the data they combed. They laid those nights against the moon in the very same way, and asked the very same question. The effect was not there. In sample after sample, the signal that had looked so clean and so clear inside the sealed room refused to appear, and they went one honest step further, which is the part I find almost tender. They pointed out that other researchers had turned up the same, nothing over and over, and had never published it, because a result announcing that the moon does not matter feels like no result at all. It goes into a drawer. It is forgotten. They gave their paper a pointed and memorable title that named the exact trouble: Lunar Cycle Effects on Sleep and the File Drawer Problem. The warning folded inside it is simple and a little haunting. Interesting positive findings get remembered, repeated, and passed hand to hand around the world. The dull, careful, negative ones sink into the dark of a drawer, unseen, until an entire field can drift into believing in an effect that the full weight of the evidence never supported. That is the image the title reaches for: a drawer somewhere, slowly filling with every occasion the moon turned out to mean nothing, while the single bright night it seemed to mean everything gets told and retold at the dinner table. Science only sees the thing whole when that drawer is finally opened, and both halves of the truth are set side by side on the table. And as more data came in over the years that followed, pooling together well over 1,000 people and tens of thousands of recorded nights, the same quiet answer kept returning like a tide. Across those large numbers, there was no reliable full moon effect on sleep to be found. The laboratory signal had been small to begin with, and out in the crowd at real scale, it thinned and faded until it was almost nothing at all. I would like to stay with that a moment longer, rather than hurry past it, because it is easy to feel it as a disappointment, and I do not believe it is one. What happened here was not a failure. It was science being honest about the edges of its own reach. A small and careful study glimpsed something real seeming. Larger, colder, more patient looks could not confirm it was there, and that leaves the truth of it uncertain, suspended in the space between yes and no, and that uncertainty is not a hole in the story. It is the true shape of the thing. Most of what is worth knowing about this world looks like this when you get close enough. Not a clean answer carved into stone, but a careful maybe, held in open hands. There is a rare dignity in a body of knowledge willing to say out loud, we thought we saw it, and when we looked again, we were no longer sure. That honesty is worth more than any tidy legend ever could be. It is a strange sort of comfort if you will let it be one. The very people most qualified to tell you the moon governs your sleep are the ones most willing to say plainly that they cannot be sure it does anything at all. There is no selling in that. No glow, no promise, no secret being kept from you for a price. Only the slow, unglamorous, deeply human work of trying to see one small thing clearly, and refusing to pretend the picture is sharper than it is. So if the striking version, the deep sleep collapse on the fullest night, does not hold, you might expect the whole idea to close for good and stay closed. But it does not, because while that one door was quietly swinging shut, Another was easing open, in a different place, in a way that turned out to be far harder to wave away. And here is where the honest heart of it lives, and where those 3 nights in the title truly belong. In 2021, 2 researchers, Leandro Casiraghi and Horacio de la Iglesia at the University of Washington, published a study in the journal Science Advances. They gave it a lovely name, Moonstruck Sleep. And rather than sealing people inside a laboratory, they did the opposite of that. They followed real people through their real nights, out in the open world, across whole turnings of the moon, watching the same lives change from new moon to full and back again. They did it with wrist trackers, small monitors worn like a watch, recording without fuss when sleep came and how long it held, night after night, week after week, month after month. And they did not study only one kind of life. They followed Toba and Com indigenous communities in the rural Argentine province of Formosa, 98 people in total, spread across 3 settings, deliberately chosen to differ from one another. One community lived almost entirely without electric light, so the natural dark still shaped the whole of their evenings. Another had only limited access to it. A third lived in town, wired and lit like anywhere else. And to test whether whatever they found could reach past that world into ours, they also tracked a very different group across the hemisphere, college students in the city of Seattle, surrounded by screens and streetlights and the ceaseless electric glare of a modern night. The same people, followed across the full arc of the lunar month, so no pattern could hide itself in the ordinary noise between one sleeper and the next. This was no single night snapshot either. The measurements would gather patiently across a run of years, in campaigns that stretched through 2016, 2017, and 2018, giving any real rhythm every chance to show itself or to fall apart. And unlike the old sleep diaries that leaned on a person's memory, or the sealed laboratory that held the moon out at arm's length, this was ordinary life measured exactly as it was lived. People sleeping in their own beds, under their own open skies, followed month after month while the moon went through its slow work overhead. That is a much harder kind of evidence to dismiss, and a pattern rose up out of the data. A clear one, steady, repeatable, showing itself to some degree in all of them, country and city alike. But it was not the pattern the old stories had promised, and it was not quite the pattern the sealed laboratory had hinted at either. It did not fall on the fullest night at all. In the 3 to 5 nights before the full moon, people went to bed later, and they slept less. The restlessness was not arriving with the full moon. It was running out ahead of it. It gathered in the bright evenings that build up toward the peak. And by the time the moon stood round and complete in the sky, the very night the legend grows loudest, the effect was already loosening its grip and letting go. There was another small, precise detail that makes the shape of it even clearer. The change lived almost entirely in the going to bed, not in the waking. People's rising times barely shifted across the whole month. What moved was the front edge of the night, the hour sleep began. On those bright pre-full evenings, the door to sleep swung open later, and so the night came out shorter on that end. Set that beside the folklore, and something rearranges itself in the mind. For all these long centuries we had been keeping watch on the wrong night. And once you understand why, the strangeness of it turns into something almost obvious, and far more human than any omen could ever be. The likeliest cause is not lunar energy, nor a pull on the water in our cells, nor a message beamed down out of a glowing disk. The likeliest cause is light, plain moonlight falling at a particular hour. Consider how the moon truly moves through a month. It rises a little later each night, close to an hour later with every turn of the earth. In the night just before it comes fully round, the moon is already broad and brilliant, and it rises early, climbing into the sky in the first hours of evening, right as the sun is going down. So those pre-full nights are the ones flooded with silver light through the early stretch of the dark, the very hours when a body is normally beginning to wind itself down towards sleep. On the fullest night and the ones after it, the moon rises later and later still, well after dusk, long after many people have already gone to bed and closed their eyes. It is the long run-up, not the peak itself, when the bright hours and the waking hours overlap and press against each other. And the fingerprints of light are all over this finding. The effect was strongest exactly where you would expect light to matter most, in the community with no electricity at all, where the moon was the only real lamp the evening ever offered. It grew fainter where the wires reached, and fainter still in the electric city, where a single bright bulb has already swallowed whatever difference the moon might have made. The moon still nudged the Seattle students, but only a little, its old signal nearly buried beneath everything humming and glowing and blazing around them. That is the signature of a light effect, not a mystical one. And it points somewhere deep and somewhere strangely moving. Yet there was a small puzzle left over that keeps the wonder alive rather than closing it. The students in Seattle almost certainly were not sitting up watching moonlight pour across the hours after dusk. Their curtains were drawn, their rooms were lit, their evenings were full of the usual glowing rectangles, and still a faint trace of the same rhythm surfaced in them. That hint that the pull lingers even where the moon has been all but banished from the night is part of why the researchers wondered whether some of this is not choice at all, but something entrained, woven into the body's own timing across an immense reach of the past, and carried forward now even when the light that once set it has gone. They did not claim to have settled that. They set it down as an open question, which is the right and honest place for it. There is a grace note here worth pausing on. Well before anyone had wrist trackers or field data, a researcher had already guessed at this. In the late 1990s, an article with the plain title of The Moon and Madness Reconsidered proposed that the ancient beliefs might trace back to exactly this, to moonlight stealing sleep around the full moon in the age before lamps, and that partial loss of sleep, not any magic, tipping a few vulnerable people toward a hard night. Written well before the evidence existed to test it, it reads now almost like a message left for the future. The old legend and the new data, reaching toward each other across the years and very nearly touching. For almost the entire span of human history, we had no way to push back the dark. When the sun went down, the world mostly closed its doors and waited for morning, but for a handful of nights each cycle, the bright evenings that come before a full moon, the darkness opened back up and handed us a gift. Those were the nights you could still see well enough to travel, to work a little longer, to fish the shallows, to gather, to talk and linger around a fire, to move through the world after sunset without stumbling into it blind. So it makes a deep and tender kind of sense that a body would lean toward wakefulness on exactly those nights, staying up to spend the one measure of light the night ever gave freely. The researchers suspect this is what we are watching. Not a fresh reaction to the moon at all, but an ancient one. An inherited readiness to be awake beneath a bright evening sky, carried down from a time when that light was an opportunity no one could afford to sleep through. Somewhere in that long inheritance, sitting up under a full and rising moon was not restlessness at all. It was good sense, written slowly into the body over more generations than we can picture, and never fully erased by the few bright centuries of the lamp. Which brings us, gently, all the way back to you, and to that night you could not quite fall asleep. If your rest thins in the evenings before a full moon, if you find yourself lying there a little later than the hour would explain, a little more awake than makes any sense, the careful truth is this. It is most likely not a message reaching down toward you. Nothing is activating. Nothing is opening. No door is swung wide in the sky to single you out from everyone else. What you may be feeling is closer to a memory than to a message. A faint tilt in the body towards staying up while the moon rides high and early, the same slow pull your ancestors felt as they lingered by the fire on the light nights and let sleep wait its turn. It is a thread that runs back through nearly everyone who has ever lived, mostly worn thin by the electric age, its glare drowning out the moon's soft signal, and yet not entirely gone, in the quiet, in the dark, with the streetlights off and the moon climbing early over the trees. A little of that old inheritance can still rise to the surface. And there is a real wonder folded into that. Not the wonder of prophecy, but the wonder of belonging to something very long and very human, and much older than any of us. You are not being visited by anything. You are remembering, in the only tongue the body has ever spoken, which is feeling. Let me say one plain thing here, once, then set it down and leave it be. None of this is medical advice, and I am not a doctor. If your sleep is troubled in a way that lasts and truly wears on you, night after night after night, That is worth mentioning to someone who can properly look after you. A faint lean toward wakefulness under a bright moon is one thing. Real grinding sleeplessness is another thing altogether, and you were never meant to carry it alone or to explain it away with the sky. But for the ordinary version, the lighter sleep, before a full moon version, there is a great ease waiting inside what this turns out to be, because it asks nothing of you. There is nothing to fix, nothing to prepare for, nothing gathering out there beyond the window, no event circled in red on a calendar, no reckoning riding in on the next full moon. The moon is not coming for your sleep. It never was, and it never has been. There is only a body that still keeps the faintest time with the sky it grew up beneath. The way an old song can surface unbidden, without your ever choosing to remember it. And a science patient and honest enough to admit, plainly and without shame, that it still is not certain how far this goes. The same researchers even flagged a second, smaller rhythm they could not fully explain, and rather than hide it, they wrote it down and said it would need confirming. That is what honesty looks like, out at the edge of what we know. And maybe that is the most restful thing of all. Not a grand answer that dissolves every mystery, but a small, human-sized truth you can lie down beside and let hold you. We are creatures shaped by light. For a few nights in every cycle, a little more of it than usual spills into the dark, and something old in us stirs, leans toward waking, and remembers a world without walls or wires or switches. For a moment, you are back among the long line of people who watched that same moon climb over the same dark land and wondered at it, and stayed up a while, and were not afraid of the light. Then it fades again, and sleep returns, and the moon goes on across the sky, indifferent and beautiful, keeping no appointments with anyone, owing us nothing, meaning us no harm. So the next time you find yourself awake on one of those bright evenings before the full moon, you can let the worry go. You do not have to solve it, and you have no reason to fear it. You can meet it with plain understanding, and let that understanding be enough to rest on. The stirring you feel is not a warning arriving from somewhere out there in the dark. It is an inheritance rising up from somewhere in here, the oldest kind of light memory handed down through more years than we can count. The wonder was never in the prophecy. It was always in the inheritance. So rest easy tonight. There is nothing to keep watch for but the moon itself, doing only what it has always done, while the rest of the sky turns slowly on toward morning.